For nearly 300 years, Bellevue Hospital has stood in New York as the place where millions of people arrived when there was nowhere else to go. It began above a poorhouse, with the sick and the forgotten. But over time, its doors opened to epidemics, madness, war wounds, addiction, poverty, and disasters that shook the city. Bellevue was not just treating patients. It was absorbing America's failures. Before Bellevue became a name that New York whispered with fear, pity, gratitude, and sometimes shame, it was not a hospital in the way Americans understand that word today. It had no grand entrance, no marble lobby. No long wards lined with white beds, no operating theater, no ambulance bell, no medical school standing proudly beside it. It began with 6 beds. In 1736, those 6 beds were placed on the second floor of New York City's almshouse, on the ground where City Hall would later stand. Below them was poverty. Around them was a small colonial city still learning how to govern itself. Above and within them was an idea so modest that it could almost be missed. If a person was sick and poor, the city had some responsibility to keep that person alive. That was the beginning of Bellevue. It did not begin as a monument to medicine. It began as an addition to the machinery of public charity. The almshouse was not a place of comfort. It was where a city placed the people who had fallen outside the protection of family, property, trade, or good fortune. The old, the disabled, the unemployed, the widowed, the orphaned, and the sick could all be gathered under one roof, not always because the city understood them, and not always because it treated them gently, but because it could not completely ignore them. In that world, illness and poverty were not separate conditions. They lived in the same room. A fever could destroy a laborer's wages. A broken limb could turn a working person into a public charge. A widow without money could become a patient, then an inmate of charity, then a burden in the language of municipal records. The city did not yet have the modern vocabulary of public health. It had categories of need, and behind those categories were human beings. Bellevue's first form was born inside that uneasy arrangement. The word hospital carried a different meaning in the 18th century. For people with means, sickness was often treated at home. Doctors came to the patient, not the other way around. Hospitals were commonly associated with poverty, contagion, dependency, and death. To enter one was not always a sign that help had arrived. It could mean that all other forms of help had failed. That is why the 6 beds matter. They were not impressive. They were not enough. But they marked the moment when New York admitted that sickness among the poor could not be handled only by churches, families, neighbors, and chance. The city needed a place. A small place, but a place still. At the time, New York was not yet the vast city that would later surround Bellevue. It was a port town, crowded near the lower tip of Manhattan, tied to trade, ships, markets, docks, and the movement of strangers. Its streets carried goods, animals, waste, rainwater, and infection through the same narrow channels. Medical knowledge remained limited. Germ theory had not yet changed the world. Epidemics were feared but not fully understood. A foul smell, a crowded room, a dirty street, a ship arriving from an infected port, each could become part of the city's explanation for disease. The poor experienced those dangers first and most severely. They lived closer to the conditions that made illness spread. They had less space, less food, less rest, and fewer choices. When they became sick, their bodies revealed what the city preferred not to see about itself. The almshouse infirmary did not solve that problem. It simply gathered the evidence in one place. This is where Bellevue's character begins to take shape. Some buildings are created to display power. Some are built to protect wealth. Some are designed to make a city look civilized from the outside. Bellevue was different. From its first day, it was tied to the people a city could not proudly display, but also could not abandon without consequence. It stood at the edge of public conscience, not outside society, but not fully embraced by it either. That position would define the hospital for nearly 3 centuries. Bellevue would become famous for its emergencies, its psychiatric wards, its medical breakthroughs, its scandals, its disasters, and its endurance. But all of that came later. First came the simple fact of the 6 beds above the poorhouse. In those beds was the original promise, fragile and incomplete, that public medicine in America would one day have to answer a moral question. Who deserves care when they have nothing to offer in return? The answer was not yet generous. It was not yet equal. It was not yet modern. The almshouse could be harsh. Public charity often came with suspicion and control. The poor were helped, but they were also watched, judged, categorized, and disciplined. A bed could be mercy, but it could also be a reminder that the patient had lost the privacy and independence of ordinary life. Bellevue was born in that contradiction. It offered refuge, but inside an institution. It cared for the sick, but under the shadow of poverty. It recognized suffering, but through the language of public burden. The first patients were not remembered as individuals in the way later doctors, reformers, and administrators would be remembered. Their names do not stand at the front of the story. Yet without them, there is no Bellevue. Their bodies were the first reason the city needed the place at all. A hospital can reveal what a society values. It can also reveal what a society fears. In colonial New York, the fear was not only death. It was disorder. A sick, poor person could not work. A contagious person could endanger a neighborhood. A destitute person could become visible in streets where merchants and officials preferred order. The infirmary above the almshouse served all of those concerns at once. It helped, it contained, it comforted, it controlled. Over time, that pattern would grow larger. Bellevue would repeatedly be asked to do more than heal. It would be asked to separate the contagious from the healthy, the unstable from the public, the intoxicated from the street, the dying from the ignored, and the unwanted from the respectable parts of the city. Every generation would send Bellevue a new form of crisis. Every generation would ask the same building, under different names and in different locations, to hold what New York could not manage elsewhere. But in 1736, the story was still small enough to fit in one room. 6 beds, a poorhouse, a young city, a public promise too limited to praise without caution, but too important to dismiss. The hospital that would one day become Bellevue did not begin with greatness. It began with need, and once the city created a place for that need, the need did not stop growing. Soon, New York would discover that sickness could not be kept quietly above the almshouse. Fever would move through the streets. Fear would move faster. And the small infirmary born in the center of town would be pulled toward a new landscape, where a beautiful view over the East River would become the city's answer to contagion. The first Bellevue was a room above poverty. The second Bellevue was a place chosen because it stood away from fear. By the end of the 18th century, New York was no longer the small colonial town that had placed 6 sick beds above an almshouse. It was growing into a port city with a larger appetite and a larger danger. Ships came in from the Caribbean, Europe, and the American coast. Sailors stepped onto the wharves. Cargo moved into warehouses. Families crowded into lower Manhattan. Waste collected in streets and cellars. Summer heat settled over the city and seemed to make every odor heavier. Then yellow fever came. To New Yorkers of the 1790s, yellow fever was not simply a disease. It was an invasion without an army. It entered homes without knocking. It emptied streets. It made neighbors afraid of one another. A person could appear only mildly sick, and then decline with terrifying speed. Skin and eyes could take on the color that gave the fever its name. Some patients bled. Some vomited dark blood. Families fled if they had the means. Those who stayed behind learned to live with the sound of carts, rumors, funerals, and doors closing. The city did not yet know what it was fighting. Doctors argued over poisoned air, rotting filth, imported infection, and local corruption of the atmosphere. The mosquito, moving quietly through heat and standing water, had not yet been named as the true carrier. That knowledge belonged to another century. In the 1790s, New York acted with the tools it had: fear, distance, quarantine, and public authority. Bellevue's next transformation came from that fear. Several miles north of the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan stood a property known as Bellevue. The name meant beautiful view, and there was truth in it. The land looked toward the East River. It offered air, space, and separation from the dense city below. In calmer times, such a place might have suggested retreat. During an epidemic, it suggested containment. The city turned toward Bellevue because disease had made geography into policy. If the sick could not be safely kept in the heart of town, they would be moved upriver. If the healthy feared the infected would be placed where fear could feel managed. A farm with a beautiful view became a border between the city and the danger it could not understand. This was a new role for the institution that would become Bellevue Hospital. The 6 beds above the almshouse had answered a question of public charity. The farm answered a question of public survival. It was no longer only about whether the poor should receive care. It was about whether the sick should be separated from everyone else. That difference mattered. A hospital can be a shelter. It can also be a line drawn on a map. When yellow fever cases rose in 1795, Bellevue became a place where the seriously ill could be isolated from the crowded neighborhoods below. The decision may have been practical. It may have saved lives. But it also shaped the moral identity of the building. Bellevue was becoming the place New York used when ordinary arrangements failed. It received the patients whose presence frightened the city. It held those who were not only suffering, but dangerous in the public imagination. Inside that arrangement were real people. One of them was a young physician named Alexander Anderson, known to family and friends as Sandy. He was still very young when yellow fever changed the direction of his life. During the outbreaks, he worked at Bellevue and watched the disease move through patients, nurses, doctors, and families. He tried to serve the sick, while his own world came apart beyond the hospital grounds. The epidemic took members of his family and nearly everything that had made his future seem secure. He eventually left medicine and became known for another art entirely, wood engraving. Anderson's life reminds us that Bellevue's history was never only institutional. It was carried in bodies, in exhausted doctors, in frightened nurses, in families who waited for news, and in patients who were moved away from the city because the city did not know what else to do with them. The beautiful view did not soften the work. On paper, distance looked orderly, a site upriver, a designated place, a civic response. But the reality was harder. The patients who arrived at Bellevue were often arriving at the edge of hope. They were separated from the familiar streets where they had lived. They were placed in the hands of a medical world that was brave in some ways, ignorant in others, and deeply vulnerable itself. Doctors could observe symptoms. They could record admissions and deaths. They could offer what treatment they believed might help. But they could not yet stop the invisible mechanism of the disease. In those years, Bellevue began to absorb a lesson that would return again and again. When New York panicked, it needed a building to receive the panic. That was the beginning of Bellevue as a civic instrument. The city did not merely ask it to care. It asked it to contain. It asked it to stand between the visible city and the hidden forces moving through it. The hospital became a kind of pressure valve for urban life. When the docks brought fever, Bellevue took the fever. When crowded houses bred sickness, Bellevue took the sick. When fear became too large for private homes and small charities, Bellevue gave that fear an address. There was compassion in this. There was also control. The farm by the East River carried both meanings at once. To send a patient there could mean an effort to save that life. It could also mean removing that life from public view. The building's promise widened, but its burden darkened. Bellevue was learning to do the work that a growing city needed but did not always want to witness. The name itself held a quiet irony. Bellevue, beautiful view. From that landscape, one could look toward water, sky, and open air. But inside the temporary wards and fever rooms, beauty had little power. The view could not explain why one person survived and another did not. It could not console the families who fled the city and returned to missing names. It could not tell doctors what caused the fever. It could only stand there, distant enough to reassure the healthy, close enough to receive the dying. By 1798, when yellow fever returned, the lesson had become cruelly familiar. New York had hoped quarantine and caution might hold the disease back. Instead, heat, water, and crowded conditions helped prepare the city for another season of loss. Bellevue reopened to fever patients. More came. Some died quickly. Those who cared for them were not safely outside the danger. they were part of it. The hospital's character changed in those summers. It was no longer just the city's small act of mercy toward the poor. It had become the place where public medicine met public terror. Its walls, however temporary or modest, were asked to hold a question that New York could not yet answer. How does a city protect itself without abandoning the people who frighten it? That question would follow Bellevue long after yellow fever faded from Manhattan. In the coming century, the city would grow faster than its drains, streets, laws, and conscience. Disease would no longer appear only as an outbreak from elsewhere. It would be seen in tenements, garbage, unclean water, overwork, hunger, and neglect. Bellevue would learn that the patient on the bed was often the final symptom of a much larger illness outside the hospital, and eventually, one of its doctors would begin to ask whether the city itself needed treatment. By the middle of the 19th century, Bellevue had learned to receive the consequences of New York before New York had learned to name them. The hospital saw fever, injury, infection, hunger, exhaustion, and childbirth gone wrong. It saw men carried in from docks and workshops, women weakened by poverty, children marked by the conditions of crowded rooms, and immigrants who had crossed an ocean only to find another struggle waiting in the streets. Bellevue treated bodies, but those bodies arrived with the city written into them. The question was no longer only what disease had entered the patient. The question was what kind of city kept producing the same patients. Stephen Smith was one of the men who began to ask that question. He was a surgeon by training, but his importance to Bellevue and to New York reached beyond the operating table. Smith understood that a hospital could not be separated from the streets that fed it. A broken sewer, an overcrowded tenement, a filthy alley, a contaminated water source, a cellar filled with dampness and waste. All of these could become invisible wings of the hospital. Bellevue was where the evidence arrived. Smith did not look at the wards as isolated rooms of suffering. He looked at them as records. Every patient carried a kind of testimony. A child with fever told a story about housing. A laborer with infection told a story about work. A mother weakened by disease told a story about poverty, air, water, and municipal neglect. The hospital could dress wounds and drain abscesses, but if the city outside remained unchanged, the beds would keep filling. This was the burden Bellevue placed before him. In earlier generations, disease had often been treated as an event. An epidemic came, the city panicked, the sick were moved away, the danger passed or seemed to pass. But by Smith's time, the problem had become more constant. New York was larger, denser, louder, and more unequal. The city had grown faster than its ability to clean itself. Horses filled the streets, refuse collected in gutters, privies leaked. Tenements packed families into narrow rooms where air and light barely entered. What the wealthy could escape, the poor had to breathe. Bellevue stood downstream from all of it. The hospital became a receiving room for civic failure. It took in people who had not simply been unlucky, but had been shaped by the physical conditions of the city. Smith and other reformers began to see that medicine could not stop at the bedside. A doctor who only treated the patient and ignored the street was treating the final symptom, not the cause. That idea sounds obvious now. In Smith's century, it was a fight. Public health required authority. It required inspection. It required laws that could reach into buildings owned by men who did not want interference. It required the city to admit that private property could become a public danger. It required politicians to care about neighborhoods they did not live in, and people who had little power to punish them at the ballot box. Smith helped push that argument into public life. In the 1860s, reformers connected to the Citizens Association of New York undertook a detailed investigation of the city's sanitary conditions. They did not rely only on rumor or disgust. They gathered evidence. They examined streets, homes, yards, drainage, crowding, and disease. The result was a portrait of New York that polite society could not easily dismiss. The city was not merely dirty, it was organized in ways that made people sick. Bellevue had known this in practice for years. Now reformers tried to turn that knowledge into law. The work helped lead to the creation of the Metropolitan Board of Health in 1866. It was a turning point. not because it made New York clean overnight, but because it changed the meaning of disease in public life. Sickness was no longer only a private misfortune or a punishment imagined by moralists. It could be evidence of bad housing, bad sanitation, bad regulation, and bad government. The hospital had pushed the city toward a new form of responsibility. For Bellevue, this changed the story. The building was still a place of treatment, but it had become something more powerful, a witness. Its wards testified against the city outside. Its patients made visible the cost of neglect. Every admission book, every crowded bed, every fever case, every injury from labor or poverty helped build the argument that public medicine and public law belonged together. Smith's own title as a surgeon does not fully capture the role he played. He belonged to a generation of doctors who began crossing the boundary between medicine and civic reform. They were not content to wait at the end of suffering. They wanted to move upstream, into the streets, drains, markets, housing, schools, and laws that shaped health before a patient ever reached the hospital door. That was Bellevue's influence beyond its walls. The hospital forced medicine to look outward. A private hospital could choose its patients. Bellevue could not choose so easily. Its openness made it uncomfortable but also honest. It saw the city whole. It saw what wealth concealed and what politics delayed. It saw the people who had been failed by systems long before they became medical cases. There was dignity in that work, but there was no romance in it. Bellevue was still crowded, still associated with poverty, still asked to manage what others avoided. Reform did not erase suffering from its wards. Laws did not make hardship disappear. Public health moved slowly, and the people most in need of its victories often died before those victories arrived. But something essential had shifted. The city could no longer pretend that the hospital's patients came from nowhere. They came from New York itself. In time, Stephen Smith would help build national public health institutions and look back on the old city as something that had been changed by sanitary reform. But Bellevue's lesson remained unfinished. A cleaner street could prevent some disease. A stronger health board could reduce some danger. Better laws could save lives. Yet the hospital still stood ready, because the city would always create new forms of injury faster than reformers could solve the old ones. Bellevue had begun as 6 beds above an almshouse. It had moved to a farm chosen for distance and quarantine. Now, under the pressure of men like Stephen Smith, it had become a mirror held up to the city, and the reflection was difficult to look at. Once New York accepted that sickness could be shaped by public conditions, Bellevue's work entered a new age. It would not be enough to wait behind hospital walls. The building would have to learn speed, training, discipline, and movement. The city was growing too fast for medicine to remain still. Soon, Bellevue's door would no longer simply open for the sick. It would go out into the streets to find them. By the late 1860s, Bellevue had already learned how to read the city. It had seen what poverty did to the body, what bad housing did to children, what filth did to neighborhoods, and what fear did during epidemics. Stephen Smith and other reformers had forced New York to understand that disease was not only a private misfortune. It could be built into streets, drains, cellars, and crowded rooms. But understanding the city was not enough. People were still dying before they reached the hospital. A man could fall from a scaffold and be carried through the streets by strangers. A woman could collapse in childbirth and wait while someone searched for help. A worker could be crushed near the docks. A child burned in a tenement room, a drunk man beaten or frozen in an alley, and the hospital might know nothing until it was too late. In a city that was growing upward, outward, and faster than its institutions, time itself had become a medical problem. Bellevue's next great transformation came from that simple fact. It had begun as a room. It had become a place of quarantine. It had become a witness against the city. Now it had to learn movement. In 1869, Bellevue established an ambulance service that would help change the meaning of emergency medicine in America. The idea seems ordinary now because the modern city cannot be imagined without ambulances, but at the time, it was a radical extension of the hospital's body. The institution no longer waited behind its doors for the injured to arrive. It sent help into the street. The early Bellevue ambulance was not sleek, sterile, or quiet. It belonged to the age of horses, mud, bells, shouting, and crowded avenues. But it carried something new through New York. The belief that the first minutes after injury mattered, and that medical care should begin before the patient crossed the hospital threshold. This changed the relationship between Bellevue and the city. The hospital's door had always been important. For the poor, it was a last resort. For the contagious, it was a place of separation. For reformers, it was evidence of civic failure. But with the ambulance, that door seemed to move. It rolled over cobblestones. It entered neighborhoods. It appeared at scenes of accident, violence, collapse, and sudden illness. Bellevue became, in a new sense, a hospital with wheels. There was humanity in this. There was also discipline. The ambulance did not arrive only for the respectable patient. It came for whoever had fallen into public emergency. Laborers, immigrants, children, alcoholics, victims of industrial accidents, and people found unconscious in the street. The same open-door promise that had defined Bellevue now traveled outward into a city that did not always want to look closely at the people lying on its pavement. The ambulance also brought order to chaos. Before such systems developed, emergency care could be improvised, delayed, or dependent on luck. Bellevue's service suggested that a city could organize speed. It could assign responsibility. It could make urgency part of public medicine instead of leaving it to bystanders and chance. Yet speed alone could not make medicine modern. Inside the hospital, another transformation was taking place. Bellevue was becoming a place where care was not merely given, but taught. Its wards were crowded, difficult, and often heartbreaking, but they also became classrooms. The poor, the injured, and the desperate arrived in such numbers that doctors learned from them constantly. Bellevue became one of the places where American medicine trained itself on the realities of urban life. This fact carried a moral tension. A public hospital could teach because it received everyone. It saw more injuries, more diseases, more emergencies, and more forms of social collapse than many private institutions. That made it invaluable to medicine. It also meant that the bodies of the poor often became the ground on which professional knowledge advanced. Bellevue gave care, but it also observed. It treated, but it also studied. It relieved suffering, but it learned from suffering. The building was becoming a machine for public knowledge. In 1873, the Bellevue Training School for Nurses opened, shaped by the principles associated with Florence Nightingale. This was another quiet revolution. Nursing had long been treated as low-status labor, too often associated with exhaustion, poor training, and moral suspicion. The new model insisted that nursing required discipline, cleanliness, skill, and professional formation. Women entered Bellevue not only as caretakers, but as trained participants in modern medicine. Their work changed the feel of the hospital. Clean hands, ordered wards, careful observation, records, routines, and bedside discipline became part of the architecture of care. A hospital is made of brick and stone, but it is also made of habits. Nurses helped build those habits. They turned chaos into pattern. They noticed changes before they became disasters. They carried the burden of suffering hour by hour, in ways the official histories often mention too briefly. Then came another sign that Bellevue was learning to organize the city's pain by category and urgency. In 1874, it opened a children's clinic. That detail matters because childhood had always been present in the hospital, but a clinic for children meant a more specific recognition. Children were not simply small adults. Their illnesses, injuries, fears, and needs required attention of their own. In a city of tenements and immigrant families, this was not a sentimental reform. It was a practical admission that poverty entered the body early. 2 years later, in 1876, Bellevue created an emergency pavilion. The name itself tells us what had changed. Emergency was no longer only an incident. It had become a field of medicine. A pavilion built for urgency acknowledged that the modern city produced sudden harm in patterns large enough to require architecture. Accidents, violence, burns, fractures, poisonings, collapses, and street injuries needed their own entrance into the hospital's life. Bellevue had taught America something that now seems obvious. Medicine must arrive in time, or it may not matter how advanced it becomes. But the cost of this lesson was written into the building every day. To become faster, Bellevue had to become more exposed. The ambulance brought the street into the ward. The emergency pavilion concentrated the city's violence and misfortune under one roof. The nursing school and clinics brought order, but they also revealed how endless the need had become. The hospital was no longer only a refuge at the edge of poverty. It had become part of New York's nervous system. When something broke in the city, Bellevue felt it. When someone fell, Bellevue was called. When the city moved too quickly and left a body behind, Bellevue sent out horses, wheels, hands, and trained eyes. The building had crossed another threshold. It was no longer waiting for the wounded city to arrive. It was going out to meet it. There remained one form of suffering that no ambulance could solve by speed alone. It did not always bleed. It did not always leave a visible wound. It frightened families, police officers, doctors, and neighbors alike. Soon, Bellevue would be asked to hold not only the injured body, but the troubled mind. By the end of the 19th century, Bellevue had learned to arrive in time for the injured body. Its ambulances moved through the streets. Its emergency pavilion received the broken, the burned, the poisoned, and the unconscious. Its nurses brought discipline into crowded wards. Its doctors trained themselves on the daily emergencies of a city that had grown too fast for older forms of care. But there was another kind of suffering that did not always announce itself with blood. It could arrive as confusion. Silence, terror, delirium, despair, violence, a refusal to speak, a refusal to stop speaking. A person might be brought in by family, by police, by strangers, or by no one at all. Some came after drinking had taken over their bodies and their homes. Some came after grief, poverty, infection, injury, age, or fear had altered the way they moved through the world. Some were ill in ways the medicine of the time barely understood. Bellevue had always received people at the edge of public patience. Now it was asked to receive the troubled mind. In 1879, the hospital created a pavilion for the insane. The phrase belongs to its time, and it carries the hard sound of that time with it. To modern ears, it is blunt and cruel. But the decision to build a separate pavilion also marked a shift. Mental illness was no longer only a family shame, a police matter, a moral failure, or a problem to be hidden in a poorhouse. At Bellevue, it began to take on a more formal medical shape. This did not mean the care was gentle by modern standards. It did not mean the institution understood the people inside those rooms in the way a later century would try to understand them. Bellevue's psychiatric history contains restraint, crowding, fear, and all the limitations of its age. But it also contains an important effort to move mental suffering into the language of medicine. That effort was not simple. A public hospital does not receive the clean version of any problem. Bellevue did not see mental illness separated from poverty, alcohol, homelessness, immigration, police contact, family collapse, and untreated physical disease. It saw people as they arrived from the street, often in crisis, often without anyone able to explain what had happened before the hospital door opened. The mind was not presented to Bellevue as an abstract medical subject. It came wrapped in the pressures of the city. In 1892, Bellevue added a ward for alcoholics. That addition tells its own story. Alcoholism was not treated only as illness, and often not treated with much sympathy. It was tied to shame, disorder, poverty, masculinity, domestic violence, unemployment, and police intervention. Yet the creation of a ward meant that the hospital recognized a recurring human condition, too large to leave entirely to jail cells and sidewalks. Once again, Bellevue stood between punishment and care. The building was asked to hold people who frightened others, embarrassed families, disrupted streets, and did not fit into the respectable image of medicine. A private hospital could avoid many of them. Bellevue could not. Its duty as a public institution made it difficult, and sometimes impossible, to turn away from the parts of the city that other institutions preferred not to see. This is where the name Bellevue began to change in the public imagination. For doctors and reformers, it could mean service, training, emergency care, and public responsibility. For many New Yorkers, it increasingly meant something darker and more simplified. Bellevue became associated with psychiatric crisis. The name itself began to carry a social warning. To say someone belonged at Bellevue was not usually an act of compassion. It was a way of marking that person as unstable, dangerous, or beyond ordinary life. The hospital was trying to create a place for treatment. The city was turning its name into a label. In the early 20th century, one of the people who tried to change that meaning was Dr. Maynaz Gregory. He spent his career in Bellevue's psychiatric division and understood that language mattered. The words used around mental illness could either narrow a patient into fear or open the possibility of treatment. Gregory wanted a more modern psychiatric building, one that would move beyond the older image of confinement and toward a medical vision of the mind. He called the idea a temple of mental health. The phrase may sound almost too hopeful now, but it shows the ambition behind the project. Gregory was not imagining a warehouse for human distress. He was imagining a building that would say, through its design and purpose, that psychiatric patients were patients. They were not simply criminals, embarrassments, or public nuisances. They were people whose suffering deserved study, care, and a serious place in medicine. In 1931, Bellevue's psychopathic hospital opened. The word psychopathic did not mean then what it often suggests now. In that period, it referred more broadly to mental disorder and psychiatric treatment. The building rose with the confidence of reform. It was designed in an architectural language that tried to give dignity to a field surrounded by suspicion. Instead of hiding psychiatric care in a neglected corner, Bellevue placed it in a major structure with a public face. The building itself became an argument. It argued that the mind belonged within medicine. It argued that psychiatric patients should not be treated as an afterthought. It argued that a public hospital could be a center of serious psychiatric work, not merely a dumping ground for people removed from the street. In its best intentions, it was one of Bellevue's most humane transformations. But buildings do not control what the public does with their names. The new psychiatric hospital could not erase older fears. It could not dissolve the stigma surrounding mental illness. It could not prevent newspapers, jokes, police habits, family shame, and street language from turning Bellevue into shorthand for a place where people were sent when they no longer fit the rules of ordinary conduct. That was the cruel paradox. Bellevue tried to make mental illness visible as a medical condition. Visibility also made it easier for the public to attach fear to the building. The more Bellevue accepted psychiatric crisis, the more the city associated Bellevue with crisis itself. The hospital became necessary and mocked, relied upon and stigmatized, respected by reformers, and reduced by slang. Inside, the work remained human. A patient brought through Bellevue's psychiatric doors was not a symbol. That person might be terrified, exhausted, intoxicated, hallucinating, grieving, injured, or simply unable to survive another night outside. Some were dangerous. Many were more vulnerable than dangerous. Some needed protection from others. Some needed protection from themselves. Some needed a language no one had yet learned to speak well. Bellevue received them anyway. This was the meaning of its open door in psychiatric history. Not that the hospital was perfect. It was not. Not that its care always matched its ideals. It did not. But Bellevue kept accepting the people who forced medicine, law, family, and city government to confront a question they often wanted to postpone. When a person's mind breaks under the weight of illness or life, where does that person belong? The answer was never comfortable. Bellevue belonged to the space between mercy and fear. It gave New York a place to send people in crisis, but it also carried the stain of being that place. The hospital's public reputation darkened because it did what the city demanded of it. It took in the patients who made others uncomfortable and then bore the blame for what their suffering revealed. By the time Bellevue's psychiatric name entered American culture, the building had crossed another threshold. It was no longer only the hospital of the poor, the fevered, the injured, and the emergency case. It had become the hospital of the mind, And with that role came a burden even heavier than medical difficulty. It had to fight not only disease, but the names people gave to disease. And beyond those psychiatric doors, another corridor was forming. It was filled with the people no clean category could hold: the homeless, the addicted, the undocumented, the abandoned, the violent, the fragile, and the ashamed. Bellevue had learned to see the mind, but the city was still sending it everyone it did not know how to name. By the early 20th century, Bellevue had become more than a hospital. It had become a corridor through which New York moved the people it did not know how to place anywhere else. Some arrived because they were injured, some because they were sick, some because they were drunk, confused, violent, silent, abandoned, or simply too poor to enter another door. They came from tenements, docks, police stations, lodging houses, factories, sidewalks, ferries, and other hospitals. The city had many names for them. Bellevue had beds. That was the difference. A private hospital could protect its reputation. It could choose carefully, limit admissions, avoid certain cases, and keep its wards from becoming too closely associated with poverty or death. Bellevue did not have that freedom. Its public duty was also its public burden. It received the difficult patient, the expensive patient, the patient without family, the patient without money, the patient no institution wanted to claim. The phrase unwanted must be used carefully here. The people themselves were not unwanted in any moral sense. They were human beings in crisis. What was unwanted was the cost of caring for them, the disorder they represented, the death they might bring into a hospital's statistics, and the discomfort they caused in a city that preferred to think of progress as clean, upward, and respectable. Bellevue stood where that illusion failed. In the late 19th century, New York newspapers began reporting a practice that would later be recognized as patient dumping. Private hospitals, according to these reports, were sending poor and gravely ill patients to Bellevue, sometimes by ambulance, sometimes when the journey itself could worsen the patient's condition. The logic was simple and cruel. Bellevue was public. Bellevue was large. Bellevue was expected to take them. A hospital built around an open door had become vulnerable to being used by those with doors they could close. This was not only a medical problem. It was a civic confession. The city had created a public institution to care for people without options, but that same institution allowed other parts of the medical world to avoid responsibility. Bellevue became the place where the ideal of public care met the economics of private refusal. Inside the building, these distinctions mattered less than the next patient coming through the door. The corridor did not sort people by moral worth. It sorted them by urgency, by ward, by symptom, by the practical necessities of a crowded hospital. A man brought in from the Bowery might lie near a laborer injured at work. An immigrant mother might wait near a person taken from a police station. A patient with tuberculosis might pass through the same institutional world as a person with alcoholism, delirium, infection, or a broken bone. The city outside separated people by class, neighborhood, language, and respectability. Bellevue rearranged them by need. That rearrangement was one of the hospital's quiet powers. It forced doctors and nurses to see the city as it actually was, not as reform speeches or real estate brochures described it. The wards contained the immigrant city, the working city, the sleeping in doorways city, the drunk city, the hungry city, the injured city, and the city too ashamed to call for help until collapse made secrecy impossible. Bellevue did not cure all of that. No hospital could. But it made the hidden population visible. This was also the world in which women struggled to enter the medical profession on serious terms. Emily Dunning-Barringer's story belongs partly to nearby Gouverneur Hospital, another municipal institution serving the Lower East Side, but her path helps illuminate the wider public hospital system around Bellevue. In 1902, she became the first woman admitted to a surgical internship in New York. The next year, she became the first woman ambulance surgeon. Her title sounds clean in retrospect. The reality was not. She entered a profession that did not welcome her, in a neighborhood where the work was relentless, and in a hospital world shaped by accident calls, poverty, language barriers, and the injuries of crowded urban life. Male colleagues doubted her presence. The streets tested it. Patients arrived not as symbols of progress, but as people bleeding, laboring, coughing, collapsing, and demanding decisions. Barringer's place in this story is not that she transformed Bellevue directly. It is that her career shows how the municipal hospital corridor changed everyone who entered it. Patients were not the only ones being tested. So were doctors. So were nurses. So were the rules about who was allowed to serve, who was believed, and who was trusted with authority in public medicine. Bellevue, meanwhile, continued to carry the heavier name. To the respectable city, it could sound like a threat. To say someone had been taken to Bellevue was to suggest a fall from ordinary protection. It might mean madness. It might mean poverty. It might mean drunkenness, violence, infection, exposure, or disgrace. The name gathered meanings the building had not chosen, simply because it received the people attached to those meanings. And yet, for those same people, Bellevue could also mean survival. A man with no doctor had a place to be examined. A woman with no money could still be admitted. A person found unconscious on the street did not have to remain there. An immigrant who could not explain his condition in English might still be touched by someone trained to recognize distress. A patient turned away elsewhere might still arrive at a public ward where refusal was harder. This is why Bellevue's story cannot be told only as darkness. The hospital's reputation was dark because its assignment was dark. It stood at the receiving end of abandonment. It absorbed the failures of housing, labor, policing, immigration, addiction, family breakdown, and medical inequality. But to absorb failure is not the same as to be the failure. Sometimes Bellevue was blamed for the very suffering it had been left to handle. That became one of the deepest injustices in its public image. The city saw the crowded wards and called Bellevue grim. It saw psychiatric patients and called Bellevue frightening. It saw alcoholics and called Bellevue disreputable. It saw the poor and called Bellevue a poor people's hospital, as though the word poor explained everything and accused no one beyond the patient. But the corridor told a different story. It showed that illness was not evenly distributed. It showed that dignity could be stripped away long before a person reached the admitting desk. It showed that the hospital of last resort was not an accident, but a necessity created by every other door that had been closed first. Bellevue's open door had become both promise and trap. It gave the desperate a place to go. It also allowed the rest of the city to send its hardest questions down First Avenue and pretend they had been answered. By the time the 20th century was fully underway, Bellevue had crossed another threshold. It was no longer only the hospital that treated fever, injury, emergency, and the troubled mind. It had become the place where American medicine revealed its social hierarchy. Some patients arrived by choice. Others arrived because every choice had already been taken from them. And from that corridor of the unwanted, Bellevue would build something else. A vast machine of public medicine, where the same patients who had been refused elsewhere would help teach the country how to save lives. By the middle of the 20th century, Bellevue had become a place where America learned medicine from the people. America often failed first. That was the hidden bargain inside its history. The hospital's wards were crowded because the city was crowded. Its emergency rooms were busy because the streets were dangerous. Its psychiatric services expanded because suffering of the mind had nowhere else to go. Its physicians saw rare conditions, advanced disease, untreated injury, infection, addiction, trauma, and poverty, not because those things were unusual in New York, but because Bellevue was the place where they finally became impossible to ignore. Out of that pressure came progress. Bellevue did not become important to American medicine by standing apart from suffering. It became important because suffering passed through its doors in every form a city could produce. The same openness that made Bellevue grim in the public imagination made it invaluable as a teaching hospital. A private institution might see selected patients. Bellevue saw the city without selection. That made it a hard school. Young doctors learned there because Bellevue did not soften the lesson. The hospital taught anatomy through injury, diagnosis through confusion, surgery through urgency, psychiatry through crisis, and public health through failure. It trained physicians in a world where the patient was not a neat case in a textbook, but a person arriving from a dock, a tenement, a factory, a police wagon, an ambulance, or another hospital that had already decided not to keep him. The building had become a machine of firsts. But the phrase can mislead if it is spoken too proudly. A first is not only a medal in an institutional history, it is also evidence of need. The first laboratory, the first clinic, the first ward, the first new procedure, the first organized response to catastrophe, each one tells us that some older method had failed. Bellevue innovated because ordinary care was not enough for the city it served. In the late 19th century, its connection to medical education deepened. Bellevue's medical college, residency training, laboratories, and clinical wards helped shape the modern idea of a hospital as a place where care, teaching, and research belonged together. The hospital was no longer only receiving disease. It was studying it, classifying it, recording it, and using it to train the next generation. The Carnegie Laboratory, opened in the 1880s, marked one of those changes. Pathology and bacteriology were beginning to alter the way doctors understood disease. The invisible world was becoming visible through microscopes, stains, cultures, and laboratory discipline. Bellevue, once a place where illness had been managed with limited knowledge and great fear, was now part of a new scientific age. The hospital's character changed again. Brick walls and patient wards were no longer enough. Bellevue now needed laboratories, amphitheaters, records, instruments, and trained specialists. The building became a mind as much as a shelter, gathering information from each patient and turning that information into medical knowledge. Yet this knowledge did not come from nowhere. It came from patients whose names rarely survived in public memory. Poor patients, immigrant patients, black patients, women who had been denied private comfort, men injured in dangerous work, children weakened by overcrowded housing, people whose bodies carried the consequences of unequal life. Bellevue's greatness was built partly on the fact that these patients could not easily choose a different place. This is not an accusation that erases the care given there. It is a truth that makes the care more complicated. Many Bellevue doctors and nurses served with discipline and courage. Many patients survived because the hospital existed. But public medicine has always carried a moral question. When the poor become the basis of medical advancement, who receives the honor and who bears the cost? Bellevue forced that question into the open. In the 20th century, the hospital continued to develop specialized forms of care. Cardiac clinics, metabolic wards, surgical advances, emergency systems, laboratories, and intensive treatment units turned Bellevue into a place where modern medicine became more organized and more ambitious. The hospital was not merely reacting to crisis anymore. It was building structures to master crisis. A catastrophe unit was created because disasters were no longer exceptional in a modern city. A cardiopulmonary laboratory emerged because the heart and lungs could be studied with a precision earlier physicians could barely imagine. Intensive care became necessary because survival itself had entered a new stage. It was no longer enough to treat a disease and hope. Machines, monitoring, oxygen, blood chemistry, surgery, and specialized teams could hold a patient at the edge of death for longer than medicine had once believed possible. Bellevue was learning how to keep people alive in ways that earlier generations would have considered unreachable. That achievement had grandeur. It also had weight. The more medicine could do, the more the hospital was asked to do. A place that could manage the impossible would be given impossible patients. The building's reputation as a last resort grew alongside its reputation for innovation. The city sent Bellevue the abandoned because it was public. Doctors sent difficult cases because it was capable. Emergencies came because it was prepared. Every advancement widened the door. In the 1930s, research connected to Bellevue contributed to the discovery of streptokinase, a substance that would later become important in treating blood clots and heart attacks. Later decades brought transplant surgery, advances in hepatitis B immunization, trauma care, intensive care, and infectious disease treatment. These were not small additions to medicine. They shaped how hospitals across the country understood survival. But inside the story of firsts, the building remained itself. Bellevue was still the hospital of the person with no other place to go. It was still the hospital where science met poverty at close range. It was still the hospital where progress walked through crowded corridors, past police guards, psychiatric patients, emergency stretchers, exhausted nurses, and families waiting for news they feared to hear. That is why Bellevue cannot be remembered only as a place of darkness or only as a place of triumph. It was both because the city required it to be both. The same wards that carried stigma also carried discovery. The same public mission that made Bellevue overburdened made it essential. The same patients dismissed by other institutions helped teach American medicine what disease looked like when it was not filtered by wealth. By the late 20th century, Bellevue had already survived poverty, epidemics, medical ignorance, public fear, overcrowding, psychiatric stigma, and the relentless injuries of urban life. It had become a great engine of public medicine. But then a new illness appeared, one that exposed fear in doctors, families, politicians, churches, newspapers, and hospitals across the country. It was not only a medical crisis, it was a moral test. And once again, the patients came to Bellevue. By the time the AIDS crisis entered New York, Bellevue had already spent nearly 2.5 centuries receiving the people other institutions feared, misunderstood, or refused. It had known yellow fever, overcrowding, psychiatric stigma, industrial injury, alcoholism, poverty, and the long punishment of being a public hospital in a city that needed it more than it praised it. But AIDS brought a different kind of test. In the early years, the disease arrived surrounded by silence, rumor, shame, and political delay. Doctors did not yet understand enough. Families were frightened. Some patients were abandoned. Some were blamed before they were treated. Newspapers searched for language. Politicians searched for distance. Hospitals across the country struggled not only with the medical facts of the epidemic, but with the moral pressure it placed on every person and institution that came near it. Bellevue had been built for that pressure, even if no one would have chosen it. The patients who came with AIDS were often young. Many were gay men. Many were people who used intravenous drugs. Some were poor. Some were immigrants. Some had already learned that a diagnosis could cost them friends, jobs, housing, touch, and the ordinary kindness people expect when they are ill. The disease attacked the body, but fear attacked the person around the body. Once again, Bellevue's door mattered. In 1985, Bellevue created the first AIDS program in a New York City public hospital. The date is important because it places the hospital in the middle of the crisis, before the disease had become manageable, before treatment had turned it into the chronic condition many patients can live with today, and before public sympathy had caught up with the scale of loss. At Bellevue, AIDS was not an abstraction. It was a bed, a chart, a fever, a rash, a wasting body, a nurse entering a room, a doctor trying to explain what could not yet be cured. It was a patient who needed food, housing help, infection control, dignity, and time. It was a public hospital doing what it had always done, taking in people whose suffering had become too complicated for medicine alone. The old pattern returned, but with a new wound. Yellow fever had taught New York to fear contagion. Bellevue's psychiatric wards had shown how easily fear becomes stigma. AIDS brought both lessons together. The disease frightened the public, but the people who carried it were often judged as much as treated. Bellevue had to care for the illness and resist the meaning others tried to attach to the patient. That resistance was not dramatic. It was daily. It happened in rooms where staff continued to touch patients when others were afraid. It happened in clinics where nutrition, social work, counseling, and medicine had to be woven together because the disease did not attack only cells. It attacked the whole structure of a life. It happened in the quiet decision to keep the door open when fear gave other institutions reasons to hesitate. Bellevue's plague years did not end with AIDS. On September 11, 2001, New York was struck by a different kind of catastrophe. The towers fell downtown, but the consequences did not remain downtown. Dust moved through the air. smoke lingered. Workers, residents, students, office employees, cleanup crews, and passers-by carried the event in their lungs, throats, nerves, and sleep. The disaster became environmental, medical, psychological, and political. Bellevue's role changed again. In 2005, the hospital opened the first World Trade Center Environmental Health Center for survivors of 9/11. This was not only emergency medicine, it was long memory turned into medical practice. The hospital was no longer treating the moment of disaster alone. It was treating the years after the moment, when the cameras had moved on and the body was still keeping the record. This was a familiar task for Bellevue. For nearly 3 centuries, the hospital had understood that public suffering does not end when public attention ends. The poor remained sick after reform speeches. The mentally ill remained vulnerable after architectural promises. AIDS patients remained in need after panic became policy. And now, people exposed to the World Trade Center disaster needed care after the city had begun rebuilding its skyline. Bellevue became a place where history returned as symptoms. Then, in 2012, the hospital itself became vulnerable. Hurricane Sandy moved into New York with water, wind, darkness, and a force that made the city's confidence look fragile. Bellevue had survived epidemics, wars, stigma, and neglect. But this time the threat did not arrive through a patient. It rose through infrastructure. Power failed. Fluting endangered systems that modern hospitals depend on so completely that they become almost invisible. Elevators, pumps, lights, computers, oxygen, heat, records, communication. For once, the great receiving institution could not simply receive. Patients had to be moved. Staff had to carry out the kind of work no hospital wants to imagine. Evacuation under pressure, floor by floor, person by person, with fragile lives dependent on coordination, strength, and calm. The building that had so often stood between New York and disaster was now inside the disaster. By the evening of November 3, 2012, Bellevue was empty of patients. The sentence feels almost impossible after everything that came before it. Since 1736, Bellevue had existed because someone always needed a bed. The poorhouse infirmary, the fever farm, the emergency pavilion, the psychiatric hospital, the AIDS ward, the trauma rooms, the clinics, the intensive care units. All of them had been built around the same assumption. There would always be someone inside. But after Sandy, there was a silence that history had almost never allowed Bellevue to know. The oldest public hospital in America, the building that had carried the unwanted and the contagious and the injured and the abandoned, stood without patience. For a brief time, the open door had not been closed by cruelty or indifference. It had been closed because the building itself had been wounded. That moment revealed something essential about Bellevue. A hospital is not only doctors, nurses, patients, and beds. It is also electricity, water, stairs, walls, generators, elevators, kitchens, pharmacies, basements, and pipes. It is a promise made through infrastructure. When that infrastructure fails, the moral promise becomes physically difficult to keep. Sandy showed that even Bellevue had limits, but it also showed why the building mattered. An ordinary institution might have been remembered for closing. Bellevue was remembered because its emptiness felt like a rupture in the city's oldest covenant of care. The hospital that had taken in nearly every kind of fear New York could produce had finally been forced to pause. It would not stay empty. When Bellevue reopened, it entered a new age of public medicine, one shaped by global disease, special pathogens, and the knowledge that an outbreak anywhere could reach New York quickly. The old hospital on First Avenue had already survived the plague years of 1 century. Soon, another patient would arrive under the watch of the world, and Bellevue would be asked again whether its oldest promise still held. After Hurricane Sandy, Bellevue stood in a condition that history had almost never allowed: empty. For a hospital born from 6 beds above a poorhouse, emptiness was not peace. It was interruption. Bellevue had existed because New York always had someone who needed a place to go. The fevered had come, the injured had come, the mentally ill had come. The poor, the abandoned, the intoxicated, the contagious, the overworked, the undocumented, the uninsured, and the dying had come. For nearly 3 centuries, the building's meaning had depended on arrival. Then the patients were gone. The silence after Sandy was not the silence of completion. It was the silence of a promise under repair. Basements had flooded. Systems had failed. The infrastructure that held modern medicine together had been exposed as fragile. Bellevue had long taught the city that care was more than intention. It required electricity, water, elevators, medicine, trained hands, clean rooms, oxygen, and a building that could keep functioning when everything outside it broke. When those systems were restored, Bellevue reopened into a different world. The old public hospital had always been shaped by epidemics, but the 21st century brought a new kind of fear. Disease no longer belonged to one neighborhood, one port, or one season. A virus could cross oceans in the time it took a plane to land. A patient could leave one continent and arrive in New York before symptoms fully appeared. The city was still a harbor, but now the harbor was global. In October 2014, Dr. Craig Spencer entered Bellevue with Ebola. He was not a nameless symbol. He was a physician who had worked with patients in West Africa during the largest Ebola outbreak in history. When he became ill after returning to New York, the city's fear turned quickly toward Bellevue. Reporters gathered. Officials spoke carefully. The public watched for signs that one case might become something larger. Bellevue had seen this pattern before. Yellow fever had once taught New Yorkers to fear the infected body. AIDS had shown how fear could attach itself to identity, morality, and rumor. Ebola brought back the old question in a modern form. Could a public hospital care for a frightening disease without surrendering to panic? The answer came not through speeches, but through preparation. Inside Bellevue, a trained team cared for Spencer in isolation. They managed protective equipment, waste, procedures, fear, and fatigue. Every movement mattered. Every layer of clothing mattered. Every handoff mattered. This was medicine as choreography, built from discipline rather than drama. The hospital did not defeat Ebola by being heroic in the old romantic sense. It did it by being careful. When Spencer recovered and left Bellevue in November 2014, the event became more than one patient's survival. It proved that a large public hospital in the middle of New York could safely treat one of the world's most feared diseases. Bellevue had taken an ancient role and translated it into a modern system. The fever farm by the East River had become a biocontainment unit. The old lesson had not disappeared, it had been updated. After Ebola, Bellevue's work did not retreat back into memory. It became part of a national network for special pathogens. The hospital helped train others to identify, isolate, transport, and treat patients with severe infectious diseases. Its experience was no longer only local. What Bellevue had learned in New York could help hospitals elsewhere prepare for the next unknown arrival. That is one of the quiet consequences beyond the building. Bellevue's history had always reached past its walls. Stephen Smith had turned hospital suffering into public health reform. The ambulance service had changed the timing of emergency care. The nursing school had helped professionalize bedside discipline. The psychiatric buildings had changed, and also complicated, the public language of mental illness. AIDS care had tested the meaning of dignity when fear and stigma were everywhere. Now Bellevue's special pathogen work carried the same pattern forward. The building received danger, learned from it, and sent that knowledge outward. Then came COVID-19. In the spring of 2020, New York became one of the early centers of the pandemic in the United States. Ambulances moved through streets that had gone strangely quiet. Emergency rooms filled. Intensive care units stretched. Doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, technicians, cleaners, clerks, transport workers, and guards entered a season when every shift seemed to ask more than the last one had. Bellevue was not outside that catastrophe. It was inside it. The hospital treated critically ill patients in a city where the disease fell hardest on people already carrying the weight of inequality. Essential workers, immigrants, the poor, the elderly, people in crowded housing, people with chronic illness, and people who could not move their lives onto a laptop all stood closer to danger. Once again, Bellevue saw that disease was never only biological. It traveled through work, housing, race, money, language, and access to care. The old hospital knew this truth before America had words for it. COVID-19 made it visible again. Bellevue's story does not end with a clean victory. It cannot. Too many people died. Too many workers carried grief home. Too many families said goodbye through phones, glass, or not at all. A public hospital can serve bravely and still be unable to save everyone placed in its care. To pretend otherwise would dishonor the record. But the hospital did not stay empty. That is the meaning of Bellevue at the end of this story. Not perfection, not innocence, not a triumphant monument untouched by failure. Bellevue has been overcrowded, stigmatized, underfunded, misunderstood, and sometimes used as the city's place of last resort because other doors were easier to close. Yet it remained. From 6 beds above an almshouse to a fever farm, from ambulances to psychiatric wards, from AIDS clinics to Ebola isolation, from Sandy's darkened corridors to COVID-19 intensive care rooms, Bellevue kept returning to the same public question. When a human being arrives with nothing but need, will the door open? For almost 300 years, the answer has never been simple. But the door has opened again and again. Bellevue is not America's oldest public hospital because it was spared the worst of history. It is the oldest because the worst kept arriving, and the building kept being asked to receive it. The forgotten history of Bellevue is not only the story of medicine. It is the biography of a public promise, damaged but alive, standing on First Avenue with the city's fear on one side and its conscience on the other.